Yes, we do.
We were looking at the clock, I'm like, it's a panel. We can't have a panel.
I know we don't have a panel, so that's all I did. And I was like, oh, I forgot about it. Live and don't learn, that's fun. Yeah, wing it. Yeah, that's my motto. Just wing it. You were talking to me about the disappearing meat.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming back. Sorry for the sound there. Thank you for coming back for the second of our 4 panel sessions in our Global and Area Perspective Symposium. This morning, we're going to hear first about migration and institutional design with lessons from East Asia. And as I previewed yesterday in the afternoon, the general arc of our coverage. Thank you. The general arc of our coverage today will be to sort of follow migrants along their journey, starting with a discussion about some of the laws and regulations that govern their ability to migrate and to achieve protection of asylum in East Asian societies, and then looking later in the morning at the reception to refugees and migrants in various European polities, and then finally in the afternoon, what happens when refugee communities settle in a place for an extended period of time, like refugee communities here in the state of Indiana. how can they preserve their cultural and linguistic identity. So to start this morning, our panel on East Asia, moderated by my colleague, Sarah Friedman, who's a professor of anthropology and women's studies here at IU. She is also a faculty affiliate at our Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. Sarah is a socio-cultural anthropologist who works on issues of law and politics as they relate to marriage, family, and intimate relationships, and also that has included studies of migration as they relate to family experiences in Taiwan and China. And so I'm going to turn over to Sarah in a moment to moderate our panel. As yesterday, we'll start with about 45 minutes of introductory remarks and some panel conversation, and then we'll save the last half hour or so for questions and answers from you. So be prepared with your queries, and be sure to let us know your name and your affiliation when you do. So without further ado, Sarah, I'll turn over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that. It's great to see everybody here on a Saturday morning, so thank you all for coming out bright and early. It is my pleasure to moderate this panel today, and I'm just going to start briefly by introducing our three panelists, and then each of them will have some introductory comments. And then we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. Our first speaker today is going to be Angela McLean. She is a Korea Foundation Assistant Professor of Korean Politics and Society in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures here at IU in the HLS School. And she is interested in the interplay between asylum law and bureaucracy in South Korea and the impacts that has on various differently situated stakeholders, refugees, human rights lawyers, for instance, and a topic near and dear to my own heart, what all of this says about South Korean conceptions of sovereignty as well. Next, we'll hear from Hilary Holbrow, who is Assistant Professor of Japanese Politics and Society in East Asian Languages and Cultures here at IU. And she's interested most broadly in changing inequality in Japanese society, especially as population decline accelerates. She's especially interested in migrant labor force, both white-collar and more blue-collar workforces in Japan. And finally, Sam Voortherms, who's Assistant Professor of Chinese Politics in the Department of Political Science at UC Irvine. Thank you very much for coming all the way from California. Sam is interested in how economic development shapes government provision of social welfare in China and internal migration policies. So she's going to be talking much more about internal migration, presumably rural to urban or semi-urban, which takes place on a scale equal to or exceeding international migration in many contexts. So without further ado, I'm going to first turn it over to Angela to get us started, and then we will move on. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming here this Saturday morning. So few, especially in this audience, would disagree that forced migration is one of today's most pressing global challenges. Yet this issue felt quite distant for many South Koreans. That is until the summer of 2018, when around 550 Yemeni refugees arrived in Korea seeking safety. And their arrival triggered Korea's first nationwide anti-immigration protests, with demonstrators kind of calling for their immediate departure and stricter refugee policies. This moment was shocking, but what it really did for me was to reveal its very deep-seated, sharp irony, which is that despite all the uproar, South Korea has one of the lowest refugee recognition rates among the world's richest democracies. So for instance, last year, Korea's refugee recognition rate stood at 1.5% compared to 43% in the EU and over 80% in Canada. And the year 2023 wasn't an exception. Since 2015, Korea's refugee recognition rate never surpassed 4%. So what Korea's low refugee recognition rates reflect is just how challenging it is for asylum seekers to gain this legal refugee status. And this outcome is shaped partly by Korea's very stringent process of refugee status determination, or RSD, which is this administrative and legal procedure that the state institutions determine whether an asylum seeker can indeed be recognized as a legal, real refugee. But beyond analyzing potential reasons behind Korea's low numbers, today I want to focus on and pause for a moment to really consider what it means for individuals to go through this process of refugee status determination. So at its core, RSD is a bureaucratic exercise. Applicants must submit paperwork, endure administrative checks, and go through interviews with asylum officers and judges. So on the surface, it seems highly mechanical, bureaucratic, and even a little boring. But in reality, its stakes are anything but. In practice, the RSD process exerts a quiet yet deeply controlling form of power, dragging vulnerable individuals through maze of requirements, delays, and rejections. And most of us have dealt with the frustrations that come with everyday bureaucracy, whether it's waiting hours at the DMV or waiting for a month for our passport applications to be processed. Of course, these experiences are infuriating, but they rarely change the course of our lives. But for asylum seekers, bureaucratic delays can mean more than just frustrating experience. It can mean years of life suspended. And rejections don't mean inconvenience. It can mean deportation back to danger, often with life and death consequences. So in my work, I show that this relentless cycle of waiting and rejection inflicts lasting harm, keeping individuals in a state of kind of perpetual uncertainty and instability, ultimately depriving them of any kind of control or autonomy over their futures. So I examined these interactions through this lens of bureaucratic violence, a concept describing harm not inflicted through necessarily direct violence, but through the slow, grinding weight of administrative processes and guidelines that trap people in limbo. So to understand how bureaucratic violence unfolds on a personal level, I want to tell you a story of Chaizai, who is a 24-year-old from one of the many indigenous groups in Bangladesh whom I had the privilege of interviewing. He fled to Korea in 2019, escaping from ethnic and religious violence. So upon arrival, he followed every step of the process, submitting extensive paperwork and enduring a grueling interview only to face rejection. He appealed, but was rejected repeatedly. And after reapplying in 2022, he's still in this limbo waiting. But as you can imagine, this waiting can take a heavy toll, right? Especially because applicants who are in this limbo aren't granted the basic rights or the documentation that's necessary to sustain a stable life. As a reapplicant, Chaizai lives without an alien registration card, which is the document that grants legal existence to non-citizens in South Korea. Without it, he can't work, at least legally, so he has to rely on irregular jobs that most South Koreans avoid, driving him deeper into poverty and isolation. And on top of that, every few weeks, Chaizai has to report himself to the immigration authorities to renew his stay, and often exposing himself to these degrading treatments by the immigration officers. And asylum seekers in Chaizai's situation cannot leave for a third country because they often lack valid passport or cannot secure the necessary visa. But most of all, for Chaizai and others like him, the most painful part of this whole RSD process is how time itself is suspended. So every passing day spent waiting erodes Chaizai's ability to plan for the future. And we seldom think about this, but temporal markers such as life transitions and milestones are how we as human beings make sense of our lives. But for those who are trapped in this cycle of bureaucratic violence, time becomes stagnant and still, and with it, any sense of hope fades away. And what's particularly tragic and deeply ironic is that individuals like Chaizai, who are already physically displaced due to persecution back home, now find themselves in a different kind of displacement. This time, only it's more emotional, social, and economic. So trapped in this bureaucratic confinement, they can neither move forward with their lives nor back, a condition that I think of often as displacement without movement. So to wrap up, South Korea, as a signatory to international refugee laws, is legally committed to protecting refugees. But as Chai-Zai's story reveals, legal frameworks alone are simply not enough. The true measure of protection lies in how these laws are properly implemented on the ground. When bureaucratic frameworks that govern the RSD process prioritize control and regulation over human protection, refugees escape one danger only to find themselves in another. And our bigger takeaway here is that even the most well-meaning laws are ineffective if institutions, whether intentionally or unintentionally, fail to ensure that those in need can access the protections that are promised to them on paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I see a lot of resonance between what I'm about to say with this concept of bureaucratic violence, but of course in the context of Japan. So some of you may remember the news that in May 2024, President Biden at a press conference described Japan as a xenophobic country that does not accept immigrants. And I don't know that many Americans think about immigration to Japan at all, but to the extent that they do, I think they largely share this perception. The only problem is that this is completely incorrect. Immigration to Japan is increasing quite rapidly, and it's doing so through two different streams. On one hand, there's migration for white-collar work, and this is relatively unrestricted. So as long as you can get a job, a white-collar job at a Japanese company, you can get a visa. The visa is indefinitely renewable. You also have opportunity to achieve permanent residency and citizenship if you would like. By contrast, there's many restrictions on migration for low-paid work, whether that's for factory jobs, agricultural jobs, or low-paid service jobs like, say, dishwasher in a restaurant. And this migration for low-paid work by law is mediated by brokers. In their home countries, migrants take out large loans between about $5,000 and $9,000 to pay the brokers' fees, and then the brokers place them with employers in Japan. Now, once the migrants are in Japan, job change is prohibited, so they're tied to the employer where they first land. Migrants are not allowed to bring spouses or children with them, so there's no family reunification. And until 2018, migrants were required to leave Japan after 5 years. And this system is called the Technical Intern Training Program, or TITP. In 2018, the government passed legislation that significantly revised this temporary migration scheme. So under the new system, workers arrive under TITP, and after 3 years, they may switch to another temporary status under which, after navigating a very complex maze of bureaucracy, similar to what Angela described in the case of refugees, they may change jobs if they demonstrate that they meet certain requirements. But what's required to demonstrate that they meet the conditions is a very, very high bar. After 5 years under this second status, they can switch to yet a third visa, which permits family accompaniment. And finally, after 10 years on this third visa, or 18 years after their arrival in Japan, they may apply for permanent residency with no guarantee that they will be approved. And these restrictions for migration for low-paid work are sometimes used as evidence of Japan's unusual xenophobia. But in fact, this type of migration system, where there's relatively few restrictions on white-collar workers, but heavy restrictions on low-paid workers, this is actually what the average citizen in many different countries wants. And we can see this in research by Valentino et al., who surveyed tens of thousands of citizens across 11 different countries to understand their willingness to accept migrants of different types. And what they found was that the single biggest determinant of willingness to accept an immigrant was the immigrant's occupational status. So across all the countries that they surveyed, people much preferred immigrants who were programmers as opposed to, say, construction workers. So what Japan has is the migration system that citizens in many other countries wish they had. Still, this doesn't mean that it's a good system either for the migrants themselves or for the receiving societies. So for policymakers, one of the main goals of these restrictions on migration for low-paid work is to prevent the formation of what they see as a long-term immigrant underclass. And because low-paid migrants are mostly temporary, they maintain a home country orientation. And the idea is that even if they're receiving very low wages, they don't become this sort of settled group of people who are earning much less than natives. But at the same time, many activists have highlighted that temporary migration programs are rife with human rights violations. Because migrants arrive in debt and can't easily change employers, they have little recourse when employers mistreat them. And this has led to well-documented and widespread abuses, such as unpaid overtime, physical and verbal abuse, and many others. But ironically, both proponents of this system and critics tend to share the view that these temporary migration schemes are a kind of lockbox. So for proponents, the temporary migration system controls and contains the problems of immigrant integration. But for critics, they point out that it's what's going on inside this containment mechanism that is messy, and society-wide problems such as low birth rates, aging society, labor shortages, are all being solved on the backs of these vulnerable participants in temporary migration schemes. My research, however, suggests that this model of temporary migration schemes as a containment mechanism is flawed. And the costs of temporary migration programs are not borne exclusively by their participants. So I conducted a study looking at the earnings of foreign workers with many different employment and visa statuses. And what I found is that migrants of all types earn less when they're employed in firms that use temporary migrant labor. So even supposedly desirable foreign workers in supervisory and managerial jobs pay a price for working in firms that also rely on rights-restricted temporary migrant labor. But the same is not true of Japanese. So there's no penalty in pay for Japanese working in firms that use these temporary migration schemes. So what this means is that the devaluation that occurs of these rights-restricted, low-paid foreign workers infects how other foreign workers are treated. And the messy problems of the highly regulated temporary migrant programs are sort of spilling out outside of this lockbox that is supposed to contain them. So the lesson that Japan has for the rest of the world is that you can't have your cake and eat it too with migration policy. Although many people across wealthy countries would like to restrict low-paid migrant workers' rights and limit them to temporary stays, the devaluation that these programs enable instigate the very problems that they're designed to solve, the formation of a disadvantaged long-term migrant community through their spillover effects on other types of migrants. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for having me. Just want to start off by saying that it's an honor to join this panel. So normally when we think about migration, there's a big, thick line between international migration and internal migration. We think of international migration as being managed by these rules that states, these institutions, right? We're an institutions panel. That these institutions, that states put these institutions to control this movement. And internal migration doesn't. Well, in a lot of former communist countries, China, my specialty included, internal migration is also managed by shockingly similar institutions. So most of my talk is pretty much introducing the Chinese system to you all. So internal migration, moving from one place to another, whether it's rural to urban or even from urban to urban locations or rural to rural locations, is all managed by the household registration system, or 户口. And there are three important elements of the 户口. First, it's hereditary. So your 户口is dependent on, you inherit it from your parents, very much like birthright citizenship. The second thing is it's exclusive. You can only have one. Legally. There are people who definitely buy fake ones. And third, It controls your access to government services. Everything from pensions to education to renting those bikes that are on the street, those public rental systems, all of that can be tied to your hukou. You're only entitled permanently to those rights where you're registered. Now, this can be a little bit hard to wrap your head around for those of us who've never lived in a context like this, so I want to do a little exercise. So everyone in the room, raise your hand if you went to high school in your mother's hometown. Did anybody go to high school in your mother's hometown? Okay, oh, we've got a few. Okay, let's go back one more. Is that the same place as your grandmother's hometown? Any hands? All right, we have a few. You are the lucky locals. You were able to go to public high school. You were able to fully utilize your health insurance, the government-provided health insurance plans. And the hukou probably didn't have a huge impact on your life. Now, everybody else, which is the vast majority in this room, myself included, you are most likely part of the floating population, the population in China that doesn't have full access to citizenship rights, the full suite of socioeconomic rights and political rights. There is local voting, it's weak, and property and housing and things like that. You would join the 370 million people in China who do not have full access to their citizenship rights. Now, the system was created to implement the command economy. Well, it wasn't created, but it was really used, the modern system, to implement the command economy, which is why a lot of former communist countries have it. The central state really broke down the command economy when reform and opening happened in the late 70s and early 80s, but the household registration system persisted. And it's shifted now from one of central government trying to distribute resources from one place to another in central planning to one of local government management. Especially starting in the late 2000s, local governments got control over who could become a local citizen. So local states started erecting these institutions that look shockingly like international immigration systems, naturalization regimes. So I'll give you one example. So in 2010, there were a couple cities in southern China that started a point-based system, which was explicitly modeled after Hong Kong, Canada and Australia's high-skilled international immigration, where if you had a college degree, you would get 80 points. The point-based system in Shenzhen, if you donated blood, you got 1 point. So there are all these ways to gain points, and then the city would take the highest point earners and grant some of them access to citizenship. Now, it wasn't automatic. And in many cases, these are small numbers. So on average, across all of China's prefectures, the Dijishi, there are about, the average number of migrants in every city, big and small, is about 1 million. It ranges from about 200,000 to 15 million. The average number of hukou changers who are actually able to get local citizenship through these local citizenship regimes is 20,000 a year. Very, very few people get in. Now, some cities are much more open than others, and some are open to people that you wouldn't necessarily expect. I went into studying this saying, okay, college, degree earners, high-skilled, white-collar workers, they're wanted everywhere. Not true. Some cities really focus on pulling in their local ruralites. Some cities are really focused on that high-skilled population. So my research looks at the system as a whole as if each of these individual cities are running their own immigration systems, trying to understand why some are more open than others. And the big takeaway point is that local governments use this not only for security and to control people. A lot of people study the system through that security. You know, China is not a democracy. They use the system to control people. But it's also an extremely powerful economic tool. Cities match their local development policies with the people that they want to recruit in. And not all local development policies are dependent on white-collar work. Those that really focus on rural upgrading really need to pull the people in off the land when they displace them, say, with large machinery. And the kind of the other misconception about the system that my work deals with is a very common way of studying politics in China when you get this huge subnational variation. I mean, we're talking about a big country here that's essentially a continent, is that, well, you know, Beijing must be weak because there's so much variation that happens below it. From the political science perspective, it's the principal agent problem of the principal in Beijing, the Communist Party. Once X, Y, and Z done, they pushed a huge reform in 2014. Here we see more unregistered migrants than ever, so they must have failed. Not true. It actually greatly benefits the center to have this highly flexible, very locally specific system that manages migration internally, that allows the local governments to control the labor market to fit those local needs. And of course, this system has huge consequences for inequality, for protections from government services, and all of these knock-on effects that mirror all of our conversations so far in this symposium about what it's like to not have full legal status in one way or another. And so just in my closing remarks, whenever I talk about China and people are like, oh, okay, so, oh, that's fascinating, but I live over here, right? And that's not that's not me, right? It's not us. I just want you to kind of think about some of those kind of informal, or maybe they're formal, but things that we don't necessarily think about, those institutions that are related to migration that may or may not motivate us to move. Right? We think in this country it's super easy to move, and it is. I've moved a ton in my life, relatively speaking. But our relationship with government depends on where we live, because the government services that are, say, provided by our state, so in this country, that state level is important. Canada, the provincial, this is actually studied quite extensively in Canada, that Canadian provincial level is very important of how generous your unemployment benefits are, your family leave policies are, your access to schools, your access to public schools, right? We're at a great flagship university here. I work at a public school as well. And so we, even in contexts where we might think we have this full access of freedom of movement, there are institutions that dictate how we access government-provided goods that still shape our movement and still shape how we relate to the government based on physically where we are and where we can get entitlements to rights.
Great, thank you very much. So a lot of rich material to work with. I'm going to open with maybe a broad question, and then we can go from there into some of the nitty-gritty detail where appropriate. One of the things that struck me in all three of your presentations is a kind of dominant image in migration studies of migration management as a black box. Right? Whether we're talking about brokers, whether we're talking about bureaucrats, that migrants enter into this black box. A lot happens in the black box that outsiders can't see, and even the people in it don't necessarily know all the features of it. And then the migrant gets spit out in some status, so to speak, desirable, undesirable, somewhere in the middle. And one way that that black box has been thought of is institutions, right? What are the various institutions that shape this black box? But also how migration policies and laws interact with other kinds of laws and policies. So I would love to hear each of you reflect on what the black box looks like in your particular context. Who are the actors, who are the institutions, who are the multiple different laws, perhaps, that are coming into play? And I think this will be useful also to think comparatively across national settings, but also across that so-called international domestic migration divide. Why don't we reverse our order, if that's okay? And Sam, we'll start with you.
Okay. Yes, so I love this question because in relationship to the Chinese hukou, I literally wrote a book about this that was just published like 2 weeks ago.
Oh, congratulations.
Of like, what is the black box? So in the Chinese context, there's two kind of two frameworks. One is the fact that we're in a pseudo-federal system. So there's a central government, there's provincial governments, there's nested prefectural governments, and so on and so forth. So one part is this vertical authority that's coming down from the center that's trying to essentially create boundaries within which policy is made. And then there's the local level, and you have the horizontal policy-making processes. So in the Chinese case, especially right now, what's most important is at the prefecture level. Policies vary both above and below the prefecture level, but they have kind of like the final say. They're the coordinators. And you tend to get much more restrictive policies because everything is coordinated by the Public Security Bureau. There are more than 15 different bureaus at the local level that can be involved in hukou policy making, including, there's a human resources bureau in China, of course, but also the healthcare, the education system, the tax department, the land department, all of them can have an input, but it's almost always in every city coordinated by the Public Security Bureau. And because of this, we tend to get more conservative policies because it has that element. And then in terms of the actual policy process, it is opaque still, even to people who transfer. So I did a survey, and one of the first questions I asked was, how familiar are you with the hukou system, ranging from not at all to super familiar? I had 1% of my sample said super familiar. I had another 1% say pretty familiar. And then everybody else was either in somewhat maybe or not at all. And so it is very much, even for people who grew up in the system, very, very closed off. For the high-skilled transfer programs now, they are trying to do a lot more advertising because they're trying to recruit people, and especially trying to recruit non-locals, college graduates from other cities to come in, and you need advertisement for that. But it still remains very, very closed off. And just do one more piece, which is that some cities and the old system before these point-based systems came through firms. So firms would get transfer quota like H-1B visas, actually, yeah, very, very similar to H-1Bs, where they could sponsor new employees or as promotion incentives, give these hukou transfers. That was even more opaque, right? Like which firms get these quota? It's all gonna be, in Chinese, as we say, 关系, right? It's all about relations and how strategic firms are. So many nested versions of black boxes.
It's really interesting that you talk about public safety bureau and control of all this, because in Korea's the Korean black box institutions that govern this whole asylum acceptance are the Ministry of Justice and, to a certain extent, the courts. And the Ministry of Justice is definitely a black box, and probably most of the work that the human rights lawyers are doing in Korea is to kind of open up that black box to see what is going on. And the courts, obviously, are even harder to access because judges are traditionally very difficult to access for both researchers and practitioners alike. So the refugee law of Korea is very transparent. I mean, everybody can access it, everybody can read it. It's mostly very similar to the international refugee law. However, what's going on inside the black box of the Ministry of Justice with their kind of bureaucratic discretion is harder to kind of open up. So they have guidelines, they're called guidelines or 지침 in Korean, that the Ministry of Justice has that they keep on their own. And nobody knows about it. So recently, human rights lawyers and refugee rights advocates, they were successful in kind of suing the Ministry of Justice to open up that guideline to see what is actually going on so that we know now with the open guideline that reapplicants, like the story of Chaizai that I shared, reapplicants have to submit their alien registration cards, or there are certain practices that asylum officers engage in during their interviews to maybe discourage accepting asylum seekers. So there are these guidelines that are in place that are not transparent, and like I said, it's one of the missions of the human rights lawyers to open up that black box.
Yeah, this is a great question. So since Angela and Sam talked a bit more about government, I think I'll talk about employers and brokers. So ultimately, it's government bureaucrats and politicians who are creating the rules that govern the system, but it's employers and brokers who are implementing this on the ground. So I can give a couple examples of how this doesn't always work out as planned. So actually just yesterday, the government announced that it was going to loosen up the restrictions on job change for TITP interns. And formerly, interns were only allowed to change jobs under unavoidable circumstances. But how that was interpreted by the relevant government ministries was opaque, and ultimately it meant that very, very few people were able to change jobs. So what the government ministries are doing now is they're creating a form where there's multiple different reasons that you can check, such as, my employer violated my contract. They did not pay promised wages. I observed sexual harassment in the workplace, or I myself was sexually harassed. So there's this long list of reasons that you can now give as an unavoidable reason. But how is this actually being implemented? Well, they're creating a form which they're asking employers to make available to the workers. So I think there's real questions about how effective this is going to be. If you are an abusive employer, I think you'll keep these in a bottom drawer, underneath your coffee cups and what have you. And workers are not actually going to have access to these forms. Then there's also the question of how the bureaucrats will respond. So will they simply accept the migrant workers' story that they were sexually harassed, or will they do some type of investigation? So it's totally unclear still whether this new regulation will actually change workers' ability to change jobs on the ground. So with regard to brokers, there's sort of two different types. There's the brokers in the immigrant sending countries, who are the ones who collect the large fees from migrants. And then there's kind of the private management organizations in Japan. So the Japanese government is very aware of the many abuses in this system. One thing that brokers will do is that they'll charge the migrants an extra high fee, and they will actually pay that as a kickback to the employers. So the migrant is essentially paying the employer for the privilege of getting a job. And the Japanese government's stance on this is, well, these are just bad brokers. But often those brokers are not really operating in Japan, so the Japanese government does not have regulatory authority over them. So they try and go to the governments of Vietnam, the governments of China, and say, we want you to crack down on these brokers. Usually the governments are like, yeah, we'll do it, but nothing ever really changes. So I think that piece, there's just not a lot of leverage for anyone to get the brokers to shape up their act. And then the employment management organizations in Japan are often very sensitive to the needs of employers who they see as their constituency rather than the needs of migrants. So technically, migrants are supposed to be able to go to these organizations and say, you know, there's a problem in my workplace, I didn't get paid for my overtime. But the fact is, the real relationships are between the employers and the employment management organizations, and their priority is getting employers the labor that they need rather than protecting the migrants' human rights. So the fact that there's many different actors involved who all have very different interests makes it really, really difficult to create additional regulation that will fix things once and for all. The Japanese government has been trying to do this basically since the TITP program was created in the 1990s, but each additional round of regulation has kind of failed to prevent malfeasance on the part of employers.
So maybe one last question before we open it up for the audience discussion. If we think about East Asia, at least the region we've been talking about, historically East Asia has been understood as a migrant-sending region, not a migrant-receiving region, and obviously that has changed dramatically, really beginning in the late 20th century, kind of 80s, 90s, and then into the present. And yet, the legal regimes are still quite restrictive in many ways. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where you see either your individual cases or the region as a whole being in dialogue with other parts of the world that are more historically immigrant-receiving regions, and or providing lessons for other parts of the world that are historically immigrant or migrant-receiving regions. What can we learn, in other words, from these cases that has broader relevance on the global stage? And I'll just let whoever wants to speak first jump in. I'm not going to designate.
I'll jump in because I have very little to say, largely because I don't see China in too much of dialogue with other countries. So thinking even in terms of Chinese immigration, so like international immigration rules, their citizenship policies are some of the most closed off in the world. And especially in the last, we were talking before the panel, I think the last statistic I saw is probably quite outdated, but there's an estimated 6,000 people who have gotten Chinese citizenship since 1980. It's some ridiculously small number. I'm sure that's outdated now, but that's the only statistic I've ever seen. I think in terms of, and in the last 5 years, it's gotten harder and harder to get visas and residency permits and things like that. I would say that the one thing that we have seen in the last 15 years in Chinese immigration policies is returnees. So people who have a heritage of being Chinese, they've opened up the doors. So the initial immigration or the initial citizenship rules in China set in the 1950s were very restrictive, in part because of bilateral relationships with China and the countries where they had a large diaspora, so especially like Thailand, for example. And it was part of an agreement to keep it very, very separated. And we actually start to see some of that opening up in the last 15 years or so. So it's actually easier to return to China. And that kind of mirrors the more expansive understanding of us, like once Chinese, always Chinese, claiming that the state likes to do. But then that, on the flip side, makes stronger lines for the not us, right? So for the African immigrants in southern China, there are many that do business in southern China. It makes them even more not us. So not a lot.
All right, I can jump in next. So I'll talk about what models is Japan looking at in crafting the system? What are the lessons of Japan for the world and future directions? So models, Japanese policymakers are definitely looking to Europe, Western Europe, looking to the United States, and they're basically saying, we don't want that. They see what Europe has done with admitting relatively larger numbers of refugees, guest workers that became permanently settled populations. They see that, and they see that the second generation, the third generation of those migrants often retain distinct cultural identities, feel separated from the broader society, and they see that as very problematic. They see this as Europe and the United States have created these migrant underclasses, and we need to shape a migration regime that does not permit that to happen. And the way that we're going to do that is to make it very, very difficult for people working in low-paid jobs to settle permanently in Japan and bring their families with them. In terms of the lessons that Japan offers for other countries, like I said, I think it shows that you can't have your cake and eat it too, that all of this regulation does not actually prevent what it's designed to prevent, because having this group of people who is very easy for employers and brokers to exploit makes people perceive kind of all people from those sending countries as relatively less valuable human beings, right? So these attitudes then affect how others are treated even when they don't have those temporary statuses. And then future directions, I tend to be optimistic despite all this doom and gloom that I'm sharing. I think policymakers are also very well aware that there's declining birth rates and shrinking populations in many of the traditional sending countries to Japan. So China, shrinking population. Vietnam, projected to shrink in the future. So Japan recognizes that it's in competition with many other countries for attracting migrants to fill labor shortages in dirty, difficult, and dangerous jobs. And as a result, I think there is more conversation now about how do we make Japan a destination of choice. And one way is to provide more rights and greater labor market access. It's just that, I think this tendency is in tension with policymakers' sort of risk aversion of like something bad could happen. We could have a migrant underclass. But I think that just because of labor shortages becoming ever more dire, there's a lot of external pressure to push Japan in the direction of offering more rights.
Yeah, so in many ways, South Korea's migration policy is very similar to Japan, and especially in the beginning when South Korea opened up its borders to accept migrant laborers, it looked a lot to the Japanese model, and now it's significantly diverged. I guess when it comes to Korea's migration reception regime or system, it's heavily class-based, gender-based, and ethno-national-based. So Korea engages in a very selective migration reception. So white-collar workers are always more welcome, obviously. But it's also very gendered in that South Korea, unlike Japan, has opened up its borders to female marriage migrants to come in and marry the surplus of Korean bachelors in the beginning who were unmarriageable, right? So now they have a huge group, huge population of these female marriage migrants who came in, married Korean citizens, and gave birth to half Korean children. So now I think the government is most concerned with dealing with this half Korean children and how to tackle this declining population problem with these, again, half Korean children, because like Japan and China, they're very concerned about Korea Korea's preserving Korea's blood, pure blood to a certain extent. With regards to refugees, there is no political will to kind of change this system as it is. There's no public support either, so I am not very optimistic about the Korean government doing anything drastic to change the status quo. However, what we know for sure is that South Korea is not going to back out of the international refugee regime that they signed on to back in 1992 because they're intensely sensitive about their international image, right? So they're not going to back out and say, well, we're not going to receive refugees anymore because that is a huge hit to their national image in the international community. So they're not going to do that. However, they also realize that the current system is not going to be able to sustain itself. There are more refugees, asylum seekers coming in, applying for asylum because in their minds, Korea is a signatory to the international refugee regime, and on paper, at least, it has a domestic refugee law that purports to protect refugees. So there's little discussion among the government officials, but they are hugely aware of the problem, especially after the Yemeni refugee crisis. There's unfortunately no national level talk about it because precisely there is no political will. Nobody, I mean, to be frank, nobody cares about it. Although it's a huge problem, nobody cares about it, and I think down the line, there's no promise that something like the Yemeni refugee crisis will not happen again. It will happen again. And the Korean government has this task to face it when it happens. So I'll end it here.
Okay, great. Why don't we open up for questions from the audience? And yeah, we have a microphone.
Hi, Ryan McDonald from Hamilton Luger. I wanted to ask a little bit of maybe a simplification of here, but the point of a system is what it does. These systems are not about facilitating migration. These are about creating a resource for labor markets or alleviating some of the domestic pressures created by domestic populations. So how or what are the prospects for getting the cultural change to be like, this is not about just creating a useful workforce, but actually allowing the process of migration to occur at all? Or is it simply that this is a hill these states are willing to die on and will never accept a sort of more America-style migration policy, even though that's getting worse?
Anybody want to take that one?
Sure, I can address that. I think that it would be incorrect to portray public opinion and even opinion of politicians in Japan as homogenous on this topic. The Japan's Liberal Democratic Party, which is a center-right party, has a strong constituency within it that just is deeply committed to restricting immigration. Prime Minister Abe said multiple times, Japan is not a country of immigration. But not everyone agrees with that perspective. Certainly, opposition parties say we need to admit that people who are coming to Japan are immigrants, and we need to provide them greater rights. There's a lot of NGOs working in this space as well. That said, I think that sort of risk aversion has been the dominant force driving this policy, but I don't think that that's going to work going forward, simply because population decline is so extreme. So you've probably heard me say this before, Ryan, because I think I mentioned it last time I talked about migration here, but by 2070, population decline, Japan is supposed to have 40 million fewer people than it did at its peak around 2010. So 40 million people, that's the size of the entire Tokyo metropolitan area. Like, this is a crisis, and you can't just keep having these stopgap measures forever. I think events are going to overtake this and overcome this more risk-averse stance.
Maybe we can take another question.
Good morning. My name is Shrikar Vasan. I'm an undergraduate student here at the Hamilton Luger School. My question to the panel is about the bureaucratic, well, for lack of a better word, mess that we are seeing, right? The lack of transparency, the opacity that we're seeing. I was wondering if someone could provide their thoughts on reasonable solutions to this problem. Thank you.
Maybe I can take this one. Reasonable solutions. Okay. So I've talked to a lot of advocates and human rights lawyers who are looking for, whose main job is to look for this reasonable solution to perhaps remedy some of this bureaucratic mess, as you called it. But they start from something very minute, at least superficially. So meaning they engage in a lot of legal mobilization, so they sue the Ministry of Justice so that they could open up what they're doing on their own, right? Because that is, like I said, it's very opaque. It's not open to the public. So the main strategy that they've been engaging, in addition to raising public awareness about this injustice that's going on, the more kind of direct and practical mechanism towards solution is like suing, right? So that because we don't know what's going on in there, the first step is to kind of open up and see what is going on that's problematic. So yeah, legal mobilization. And then, I'll end it here, but that is the first step that they're engaging in.
And I'll add something to that, I think, which is that has global relevance, right? Immigration, migration is such a political hot potato that politicians don't like to legislate it. So they leave it to bureaucrats and bureaucratic discretion to implement. So I think, to a certain extent, that messiness, as you've called it, is built into the system. And resolving the messiness also requires resolving the hot potato political issues that each of the speakers have talked about, possibly. Another question.
Hi, I'm Marianne Heuser. I'm a retiree joyfully living in beautiful Bloomington. My question, predominantly for Sam, is we have seen very significant immigration from China into or through our southern border. Could you talk a little bit about how that is being politically facilitated and any projection on what's going to happen with that? Thank you.
Yeah, so I can't speak to the US side because I am not a specialist in US immigration policies, but I can talk about it from the Chinese perspective, which is this is done from my awareness and everything that I've read about it. Most of this is being done well outside the purview of the government. This is a policy failure. China often does not want they don't want people to leave. They don't want people to leave. And especially because people who are leaving, it means they have resources. It's really expensive to get across an ocean and to cross, especially because most people, so this migration, most people are flying into Colombia and then doing the whole migration trek up through Mexico. That's not easy, and it's not cheap. And so from everything that I have read, this is seen as a policy failure. People who are doing it, so China also runs exit visas still. So when you get a visa to enter another country, you also have to get permission to exit China. It's not as official as it used to be, and usually it's pretty automatic. Like there's an agreement within the essentially the tour, travel agents that you go through to get a visa for another, say a visa for Colombia, will do the exit visa paperwork for you kind of behind the scenes. But and so I guarantee that the like, I'm gonna try to get to the US is nowhere spoken in that process because from my understanding, so I've had a lot of conversations actually with tour arrangers for another part of work that I've done on hukou impact on the ability to get visas elsewhere because it impacts that too. So any sort of more permanent migration out is very strictly scrutinized. So what I've read, especially also from interviews of people who have done this trek, they say they're going for holiday, and that's their reason for exit. And I can say that a lot of the motivation comes from lack of access to resources in China. There's an old saying that has been repeated so many times, like I heard it in interviews when I was doing field work. It's also the top of a couple, it's also cited in other pieces of research for other people who study hukou. It's easier to get an American green card than it is to get a hukou. So it's trying to find opportunities outside of the Chinese system can be seen by at least a subset of the population as easier than trying to work in the system. And it's been a real uptick recently because of the economic control and there are a lot of economic problems right now in China. And so that's why we've seen the uptick rather than a political motivation to push people out. I really haven't seen any evidence of that whatsoever.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, question.
All right, thank you. So I wanted to talk about the issues on human rights, right? And so then in that case, I bring in the idea about the social construction of otherness. So when issues like, we talk about refugees, and I understand the importance of sometimes creating labels in order to, provide the kinds of the resources and the support that is needed. But at the same time, how often do we also look at how that social construction also deny, reduce, or even reject the humanity? I think which is the thing that really connect all of us, together. And so, in thinking about some of these things, should we even, think about should we even call people or human beings who are sometimes no fault of theirs have to make certain decisions that are also rooted in a lot of these transnational forces? Should we work in a way that dehumanize them, deny their humanity, or create those labels that create all of these things? Because I think the labels and the naming that we have for them have huge implications for how people are treated, where they are when they find themselves in any given situation. And from human rights standpoint, how do these constructions really work to advance or undermine the humanity of people?
I can give an example of those dynamics. So in the technical intern training program, it's in the name of the program that these people are interns, right? They're not even workers. And even though they are technically protected by Japanese labor law, but I think the terminology that's used in this program doesn't, and the very structure of the program itself doesn't leave people a lot of room for agency. And so there is this very paternalistic element to it, both in that these people would really mess up the economy if they were allowed to change jobs freely, so they need to be controlled, but they also need to be protected in a kind of paternalistic way. And so you see some employers saying, well, because these are interns, like we want to not just have them do their jobs, but we're going to take them to festivals and teach them about Japanese culture. And then some people want that, right? But at the same time, it is kind of treating them as children. You know, I don't know if they want to be going to festivals or not, right? Maybe they do and maybe they don't, but their employer is like making them do this describing this as something that they're providing for the intern's benefit. And the government is actually changing the terminology surrounding this program to get rid of the intern label. And some employers are like, oh, does this mean we don't get to take them to festivals anymore? So it is like on the ground as the terminology is changing, people are realizing that they also have to change how they think about them and what their role is in the businesses where they work. So I absolutely agree that these frameworks are very important for sort of determining how people think about them.
Angela, you want to say a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, I wholeheartedly agree how you label individuals, both for the public or like everyday discourse, is extremely important in how they're portrayed. So refugees as a term, in Korean it's nanmin, but it unfortunately has a very bad connotation, especially after the arrival of the Yemenis in 2018, because before that, most Koreans didn't know that there were refugees in Korea or what kind of conditions that they live in. So they were mostly thinking about that this problem with refugees is not our problem, it's Europe's problem or the US's problem. But upon the Yemeni refugee arrival, unfortunately, the media contributed extremely negatively, kind of bringing extremely conservative media reportage from Europe to describe Yemeni refugees sensationally and dramatically. So what was interesting was that a couple years later, similar phenomenon happened with Afghan refugees, right? But what the Korean government did was that instead of using the term refugees, they called them special contributors. And that actually was very successful. Nobody said anything about it, and they welcomed, I mean, not welcomed, but there was no nationwide demonstration against the Afghan special contributors. So absolutely, the labeling matters tremendously.
We have some hands down here.
Yeah, migration is one of the topics it interests me the most. I'm the descendant of the people who are migrating over around 1 century. Were deported to Central Asia during Stalin brutal regime, then come back to Georgia. When we came back to Georgia, they said that you are Turks. We were discriminated. When we went to Turkey, they said that you are the descendant of Ottomans. So again, discrimination. So it's a very important topic. In order to get a broad idea about Japanese and Korean migration, what's the numbers about? Yeah, who are talking? What numbers? And who are the people who are migrating? Those one who already appeared in the country and claimed refugee status, or there is special quotas like green card in American case? What's the numbers about? Or these countries are accepting migrants because of their international prestige? Or what's the numbers about? Yeah, yearly numbers for Korea and Japan? Thank you.
So the total population of foreign residents in Japan is 3 million. Just a little over 3 million now, and that's edging up on 3% of the population, so low in international comparison. But I think the increase is the really significant point. If you go back to 1990, there was only around 600,000, and 30 years later, we're at 3 million. So you see this is a pretty rapid pace of increase. About a third of those are permanent residents. Another third, approximately, is students and white-collar workers. And then the final third is people coming through temporary migration programs. Refugees and asylum seekers, very, very small numbers, similar to South Korea. Most years, it's less than 1% that are admitted. I think in total, since the 1970s, there's been fewer than 20,000 people granted refugee status in Japan.
I mean, Korea is very similar to Japan, but in terms of, so there are a lot of different labels that we can assign to these different statuses. So, you know, recognized refugees is very small. Like I said, it's like 1.53% of the asylum seekers are recognized as legal refugees, but there are a lot, obviously, there are a lot more asylum seekers, tens of thousands of asylum seekers, and a much bigger undocumented population that are not, you know, registered in officially by the government. So, you know, depending on how you label them, the population differs.
I think we have one more question right here. Has had a hand up for a while? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dahlia Townley-Bakewell. I'm actually majoring in East Asian languages and cultures here at IU. And then I have a question for Professor Vortherms. Since ethnic minorities in China are often concentrated into like particular areas, how does the hukou system, like, how are they affected by it differently from Han Chinese people?
Yeah, so there are kind of two places to think of this, right? So one is ethnic minority populations in majority Han places, and then vice versa. So it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for certain minority groups to change their hukou to get to an East Coast location. And so thinking of our black boxes earlier, right? So let me think, give an example of two cities. So Guangzhou and Shenzhen, two cities on the Pearl River Delta where almost all of your electronics are made. Both of them have a point-based system to recruit high-skilled workers. But they're very different in that Shenzhen allowed 200,000 people in on average per year for the last, well, from like 2014 through 2018. So 200,000, that's a lot, right? Especially on average. Guangzhou accepted 6,000 through their same program. And they're also a huge city, it's the provincial capital. In Guangzhou, none of them were ethnic minorities, not a single one. In Shenzhen, so these lists are public, so you can actually see people's names and how many points they got in the system. They post them online. And so I can tell you that I've looked at some of these lists. I haven't looked at them exhaustively. Some minority groups you can identify by their name. So specifically like Uyghur populations, the Muslim populations, well, especially Uyghur, you can identify by name. And I can tell you in 6 years of Shenzhen's that not a single Uyghur has gotten Shenzhen hukou. There may have been other minority groups that I can't recognize by name. And I actually think that I think they also list minority status on that public list. So I could go back and look, I just haven't. So it's very, very difficult because even though there's this very clear point-based system exactly who they allow in. It's also made the news that if you have any sort of disability, you're off the list. That even if you get the points to qualify, you will be disqualified. Now, in terms of being in the ethnic minority regions, because they are highly concentrated, most of these policies for transfers target locals, actually. They are, across the country, that's their purpose. So they actually have very strict policy controls because they don't want too much concentration in the urban centers. Where you do see openness is in the more firm-based type transfers, where firms are given quota, and then those quota are used to either recruit or promote their employers or employees. And that way, the local government can target very specifically the firms that hire people from other parts of the country to move out west, so that those benefits are really going to a lot of Han Chinese in the urban centers. If you just look at the firms, I've only seen a couple lists, because this is very like internal information. There's no publicly available information, but I've had a couple conversations with people who knew of firms and which firms they were, and they're like operating in a minority area. It wasn't Xinjiang, it was in a different minority area. The Hebei blah, 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 blah company operating not in Hebei, operating in a Western minority area. So you better believe that a lot of their employees are going to be coming from Hebei, which is a predominantly Han Chinese area. So these policies do allow some of that kind of manipulation that exacerbate existing discriminatory practices.
I hope you will all join me in thanking our panel. That was a really wonderful discussion. Really useful to see both what's distinctive about the three systems, but also the many commonalities that will map on to some of what we'll discuss after the coffee break when we get to talking about refugee and other migrant reception in Europe. So we'll start up at 11 o'clock, go grab a quick cup of coffee, stretch your legs, and back here in a few minutes to hear about Europe. Thank you.
Because I'm so used